Hello everyone, my name is Gage, and this is going to be my history project, final project for my early national period class here at Missouri Western. So, we're going to be doing a podcast today. It's going to be pretty chill, laid back, just talking, shooting the stuff. So we're going to be talking about George Washington today. I'm sure you guys know the cherry tree story, right? You could probably make it like a clickbait video. George Washington exposed, you will believe number 5, and you could do that. But that's not what we're doing here. We're going to hold on for a second. Before we really get into it, I do have a special guest today. And this is taking place on his channels. I am kind of like running the show here, but it's only right that we have him part of this. My favorite YouTuber, Mr. Gage Beeston.
What is up, guys? Gage
How you doing,
Beeston
man?
Here. Yeah, man, I'm doing good.
Oh, I'm doing fine. I like your glasses. I can
Thank
see,
you.
we kind of got the same thing going on there. Yeah. And you also have the same color walls and calendar and anyway, not important. What we need to be talking about today is George Washington. So, let's get into it. We're going to talk about him, first off, how we see him in the 21st century. So we're going to be looking at the man, the big GW, Georgie boy. Alright, here, let me take over. George Washington was a husband, soldier, general, statesman, president, and hero. Or so we look at him today. Bet you are. I like that start. As in today's world, we often look at George Washington in a nice light. In what ways? I mean, you're the college student. Care to tell me how we see George Washington? It's true. So, let's get into it. First off, we're going to check out a kid's book. Kid's book? Actually, you know what? I get that. We all remember something that we learned or was told as a kid that isn't true. Yeah, well, anyways, looking here at this book, it's titled, Who Was George Washington? It was written by Roberta Edwards. Could have swore I read that in elementary school. Very possible that you might have. It was published in 2009. Now, at the beginning of the book here, Edwards talks about how great of a leader George Washington was, stating that Washington was not only the perfect general that was able to defeat arguably the greatest military power in the world of this time, he was in the thicket with his soldiers and never got hurt once. What is he, Superman? Well, he kind of gets spoken like he is, huh?
Yeah. Is this true? Seems like some kind of hype that
we'll be getting into that. I like the eagerness, but we're gonna keep it here for a second. So, what's something that you remember hearing about as George Washington? Maybe something that you heard recently, something you remember when you were a kid. Well, anything?
I think we all remember the cherry tree story, right?
Again, cherry tree story. We just talked about that. Actually, we're gonna be getting into that a little bit later. Again, love the eagerness, but not quite there yet.
Okay,
well, make sure you hold on to that.
Well, since everything that I say somehow gets roped into something later, why don't you let me know something about George Washington, how we see him today?
Alright, I'll take you up on that. You know about the History Channel?
They have that bogus show, Ancient Aliens.
Yes, but I'm going to go ahead and spoil this for you. No, aliens did not have an impact on the Revolutionary War.
Damn.
Getting back on track here. Before Washington's time in the Revolutionary War, an article written by the editors at History.com back in 2009, it's been continuously updated as recently as February 11th of 2021, talks about Washington's early life.
Is 2009 like the golden year of George Washington information?
Not to my knowledge, but in this article here, it talks about Washington as if though he was the embodiment of the American dream before he was even seen as a thing like that. For example, in the article, it talks about how early of an age Washington was, where he was at. I believe he was like 11 or so whenever he lost his father and his mentor, his brother. It also mentions how while he did come from wealth, he did have a fondness of mathematics and was able to make a living through his sheer hard work and study. Sounds like some, stuff like that,
Sounds like
right?
a generic hero origin story.
It kind of does, and it only sounds like it because it kind of is. Though there isn't any legitimate link between George Washington and the modern film, action hero movies, superhero movies, stuff like that. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that even our media today not only reinforces the idea of George Washington, but is influenced by it because, I don't think it's such to say that these writers and directors, they pull from sources that pulled from sources that pulled from sources that pulled from the larger-than-life story of George Washington.
You know, I don't like that you said that. My favorite movies and heroes are all just George Washington.
Always has been.
No! Now, as we were saying, hey, do you mind wait till later points get brought up in this section? Not quite. Actually, you might want to write those down real quick, just so we don't forget. Great idea. Since we've looked at how we in the 21st century view George Washington, I think it's important to compare it to how he was viewed in his own time, back in the 1700s. So to start, we're going to be looking at two paintings. The first, here, painted by Emmanuel Lewentz, shows Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware, where Washington led his men to, as Schoolhouse Rock taught us, disturb the Hessians in their lair. Looking at this painting, what stands out?
Well, it's pretty bright. How'd they not get
Crossing
spotted?
of the Delaware happened around 8 a.m. Not really until modern times. Did a lot of fighting and wars happen in the winter. Obviously, it did happen, but it just wasn't that very common. It was more common for armies to sleep in during the winter or to winter in a town until it was spring. Another thing, it looks like everyone but Washington is doing something. Well, I mean, he's leading them, of course. This painting does a great job showing the stature and the image of Washington. Him standing triumphantly, leading his men as the sun rises and illuminates behind him. History says he doesn't. But when you have people paint you portraits of you like that, and like this next one on the screen here, I don't think anyone would have blamed him. This next painting, however, is done by Rembrandt Peale, and it depicts Washington on his famous white horse. Man, come on! This dude had to be a superhero. Not only does he have a background story, he has talent. Washington was known for his white horse, which almost always carried him throughout the Revolutionary War. Undoubtedly, this added even more to his image. You have a great general, seemingly impervious to damage, and he's riding a snow-white horse. You know what? I can see it. Has me wanting to run through a brick wall for this man. But hold on, aren't paintings a little biased? You wouldn't want to paint someone in a bad light, especially not him. It's true. You know what? Let's look at some testimony from his time. An organization by the name of the Washington Papers not only own his Mount Vernon estate, keep like a tour-esque sort of thing there. It also has a tremendous database of all sorts of documents, be it letters, like actual like government documents, diary entries, you name it, it's there, and it all pertains to Washington, his wife, and their family. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a couple accounts from high-ranking French military officers that were in the colonies to assist Washington against the British.
Oh, but monsieur, we Frenchmen are no good fighters.
Don't get me started on French stereotypes. I could do an entire other podcast dispelling those myths. But during the Revolutionary War, while the French weren't necessarily the greatest military power in the world, they were certainly in the top 5 power rankings. This before, during, or after Revolution Terror? Before the terror and all that. So looking at when these French officers first met Washington, the captain, Captain Cromont de Bourg, I have no idea if I'm saying that right, he said, notified of his approach, we mounted our horses and went out to meet him. He received us with the affability which is natural to him and depicted on his countenance. He is a very fine-looking man, and did not surprise me as much as I expected from the descriptions I had heard of him. His physiognomy is noble in the highest degree, and his manners are those of one perfectly accustomed to society, quite a rare thing certainly in America. He paid a visit to our camp, dined with us, and later we escorted him several miles on his return and took leave of him. Okay, so for a dummy like me, break it down. Basically, the French officials had heard of Washington, the captain had, as my fan goes on in the background, and even though they had heard the tall tales and it didn't really match up with the person that they were looking at, his demeanor and the way that he carried himself did certainly impress these French military officials and their captain. Alright, but let me fight you on something here. There's plenty of nice and good people in the NFL, but that doesn't mean that they're all superstars. How do we know that they saw him as legit? It's a fair point. You know what? Let's take a look at how those same French officials and their captain thought about the army Washington was using to defeat the greatest empire in the world at the time. In another account, Lieutenant Clermont, last name I'm not even gonna try, had attended a reviewing of the armies by Washington, having this to say about the state of the American Continental Army. On the 8th of July, General Washington reviewed the two armies. I went to the American camp, which contained approximately 4,000 men, and beholding this army I was struck, not by its smart appearance, but by its destitution. The men were without uniforms and were covered in rags. Most of them were barefoot, and were of all sizes, down to children who could not have been more than 14 years old. There were many, not going to say that word, mulattoes, etc. Only their artillerymen were wearing uniforms. These are the elite of the country, and are actually very good troops, well schooled in their profession.
So, like, not only were there little kids, they were also barefoot?
Yep. Another thing Schoolhouse Rock has taught us, that at Valley Forge, they just bundled up their feet. This French lieutenant and his fellow military men saw how bad of a shape Washington's army appeared to be in, but they knew that at his command, with his generalship, that they were a army to be feared. They were fierce warriors, and that they were going to give Britain the business.
So this guy was like legit. All right, podcast over, man.
Whoa,
GG.
whoa, whoa, whoa. Don't you remember what we were talking about earlier? About those points I kept telling you to hold off on?
Oh yeah, let's get into that.
Okay. So what do you have written down there?
Oh, nothing. I just drew General Grievous.
Alrighty, we have the last section here. What we're going to be talking about is looking through his mythology, looking through the myths, looking through everything that we've talked about, trying to sort the fact from the fiction. So, last section here, someone that you've been waiting for.
Yes. All right. So the people who are watching already know what's going on. Let's get into it.
Fair enough. All right. So, what's the first thing you got?
What's up with the cherry tree story?
Okay, so that's a lie. There's an amazing book titled "You Never Forget Your First" by Alexis Coe. An amazing book. I really enjoyed it. And it gets to the point fairly quickly. So yes, the cherry tree story is a lie. Not only is it a lie, the premise, like the central theme of it, is too. Washington could lie, and he often did, many times to fool the British and keep them off their keep them off his tail.
I figured as much, but here's one I swear I've heard before. Didn't he just keep beating different diseases and ailments?
Yes, actually he did. That's true. The big ones that he faced and defeated were malaria, multiple times, smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, multiple times, cheek erosion, sounds exactly what you think it sounds like, and pneumonia.
All right, shoot. Well, here's another. We heard from the French officers and saw those paintings. How good of a general was he anyways?
In reality, not great. Washington wasn't a great general. He lost more battles than he won, although those weren't entirely all his fault.
Okay, so what about that he was eager to be president, lead the country, set standards, and not be a king, but a president?
Well, yes and no. Drawing from the aforementioned children's book by Roberta Edwards, in another section of the Alexis Coe book, we can see what Washington thought about becoming the leader of the country that he had just fought so hard to create.
Now, hold on. We're going to take the equivalent of like a pop-up book as gospel history?
I understand, but and admittedly, I had my doubts as well. But that book is actually rooted in a lot of historical fact. We are about to disprove it a little bit, though. If you remember towards the beginning, when we said that from that Roberta Edwards book that he was a great general, some of it is to entertain children, but most of it is actually rooted in historical fact. With the primary and secondary sources that I looked at for this project, it reinforced a lot of the information that is actually in that book. So I believe for familiarity with the viewers who have already been watching this far, and with you and I, and with people who are like familiar with this, I believe that it's not a bad idea to look towards this children's book. Besides, it also is going to educate the youth of today, so it's important to see that it's accurate and that that it makes sense.
Fair? All right, go ahead, man.
Thank you. Now, Edwards points out that really Washington was the only man for the job, but he really did not want to do this. He hated the Articles of Confederation. After the American Revolution, they created the Articles of Confederation. It was a government before the Constitution that we have now, and he hated it. And he kind of got coerced into playing a role in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. But the last thing that he wanted to do, at age 57, when he already tried to retire twice beforehand, was to come back into the public sphere. But friends like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton convinced him that really the only way that this government was going to get its feet on the ground and run and do its job was that if it had George Washington at the helm. And so, as he had always done, he put his head down and got to work for his country.
Again, this sounds like a generic superhero story. Don't use that
I
meme again.
won't. I won't. But I will talk about the Code Book again, because she has excellent insight on how Washington implemented those subtle, unwritten rules that you had mentioned before, those standards, and how he didn't want to be a king. So in the beginning of the book, she has a section called his greatest hits, where she just there's a bunch of other stuff in there, but it really just talks about like the main points of what he did. First off, he gave up power after winning the American Revolution, cementing that he wanted to be a president and not a king. He was the first president, and he added hallmarks and precedents such as term limit, which wasn't really a thing. It wasn't a thing yet. But he did it, and because he did it, no one else tried to rule for longer than 2 or 3 terms. And he also had a cabinet. Because he wasn't super knowledgeable on most things in the political realm, running a government, he had a cabinet of close friends and advisors that could help him run the country. And as mentioned already, he didn't run for a 3rd term.
I suppose that, like, looking back on Washington,
in a way, yeah, he is kind of just, one of us guys. He's just kind of a dude. He got his opportunity and made the most of it, paving the way to become one of the most famous people in the entire history of the world. Might be a little bit hyperbolic there, but I don't think so.
He is just kind of like one of us.
It's okay to look back on those that we remember fondly.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
And look at them in a nice light, but we don't ever think back to FDR in a wheelchair. We don't ever think back to Reagan with dementia. We don't think of Washington as much, like, we don't think of him as just a decent general who happened to raise a militia and an army and lead our country, and he really didn't want to. However, he was very against it. We don't really see him as all these negatives. We only see him as the positives. We remember him as the great leader who, with basically scraps, took on the greatest power in the world and gave us our freedoms, even though that's not really always the case when you look at the facts.
Bro, you got me out here crying, man. Like, I'm ready.
Well, I'm sorry about that, and I'm sorry, unfortunately, but our time's up here, man. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I hope you learned something. I hope everyone learned something.
Hell yeah.
And thank you for hosting it too, as obviously it's on your channel. Love your content.
Thank you, and it's no problem. I'm glad to have had you on. I'm glad that you're dropping knowledge bombs for me.
Oh, it's no problem. Do you want to do the outro together?
Of course I do, man.
Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3.
All right,
guys. We hope you enjoyed the video,
and
we'll see you guys in the next video.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.